Hello and welcome to Perfectly Paranormal, episode 67. My name's Annaschmidt, and I'm here every week to share with you true paranormal encounters and information about devils, demons and dark energy beings that no one else talks about. And today we're looking at spirits, dark beings and mental health facilities. Now we've got a particular mental health facility that I'm going to be sharing lots of stories and observations about today, because I used to work there as a paranormal tour guide. So this isn't an active mental health facility. This is a facility that was open around 1840 and was fully operational right through to the year 2000. And when it was closed, it became what I call a spirit hub. It's like a paranormal party scene, if you want to look at it that way, where you've got many of the resident spirits from the location, but also lots of other spirits and other types of energy beings that are around the premises, that feel the vibration that this particular location puts out. Many of the spirits are present there because they're still at work, as you're soon going to hear in our first experience. Well, some of them, they simply just don't know anything else. And they like being there with their mates, just going about their daily lives and enjoying each other's company. And those spirits also like to interact with the living people who visit that site, because the site is rather large and there are a few businesses that are present there now. But quite a lot of living people who come and go. And the spirits, they will simply follow them round the site and enjoy sitting with them and watching them while they're having their lunch. I just wish I could see spirits more. I wish it was one of my psychic skills. I would just love to go to the restaurant that's on this site and just sit there and just watch the spirits intermingling with the living. Now, there's others that choose to stay simply out of fear of the unknown. Spirits have actually told me this in the past. Sometimes they don't know where they're going. They don't know what the afterlife is. They don't know what to expect. And they don't know how to get there. Now, the entities at the darker end of the scale, they're purely there, not because of the spirits, not because of the living people, but they're there to feed on the lower vibrational pools of emotional imprints that are present right throughout that site. They've been there for over 100 years. And they've been constantly building up in that time. So as long as those emotional imprints are there, those energy beings are going to be present. Now let's look at one of my most memorable encounters, which was with a spirit man. Yes, you heard me right. A spirit man who was more than happy to talk about his life and what he went through on a daily basis at that location. And I've called this fascinating experience Meeting Adam, the Convict Spirit. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I worked as a paranormal tour guide for about 18 months before COVID hit. I spent a lot of time at a local haunted site here outside Hobart, which is our capital city here in Tasmania. Now, there was a particular man. I don't know if he took a fancy to me or whether he was just looking for someone. I actually want to hear his story and understand his life at that particular facility. And maybe he hadn't found the right person, or he hadn't found the paranormal device that he could use to communicate through. This young man, I'm saying young man, I'm kind of gauging his voice. It could be anywhere between maybe 25 and 40. I know that's not young, but I can't see him. I don't see what he looks like. I can hear his voice, feel his energy. Now, his voice, I'll never forget it. It was one of those melty voices. One of those voices that make you just really relax and feel very, very comfortable. Now, he was in a mental health facility, not really for the reason that you think. His voice came to me loud and clear through a paranormal investigation device called a spirit box. This is one of my favourite tools. Other than my psychic senses, this is one of the gadgets that I like to use, just for a bit of a different approach. This spirit box, what it is, it's a small rectangular handheld radio. Some of you out there might have used one or actually seen them used during paranormal investigations on TV or on YouTube. This little radio is used to hear paranormal anomalies. This can be voices, sounds, it can be sentences, it can be yelling, it can be screaming, sometimes it can be single words, sometimes it's multiple words, sometimes it's swearing, because some spirits can use a spirit box to really get their message across, and they will tell you to get the beep out of their room. How it works is that you listen through the white noise. The white noise is the communication outlet that the spirits talk through. You're probably saying, oh, it's just the radio. You're just hearing people talking. But I run my spirit box backwards. You can choose to run it forwards or backwards, but I like to run it backwards. And that tells my brain that it's not just some random person. And the types of answers that you get to your questions couldn't possibly be the radio. It just couldn't. Because the things that you ask, you're getting rational answers to. Now, some of you still won't believe until you've actually experienced it yourself, listening to a spirit talking through a spirit box. But you can ask questions, and if they have enough energy to actually propel their voice through that white noise, you can get very clear answers. I've witnessed many varieties of personalities, from excited giggling children who'll give you a hi, hello. You might hear a little giggle. There's been lots of add-on spirits that wanted to say hello. They want to share their name. They want to ask who you are. And like I mentioned earlier, you get the occasional angry type who just swear at you using the worst possible words that you can think of. But Adam, this is the young man's name. When I first met him, it was really interesting because I just turned the spirit box on. You never expect to hear a voice. Adam had finally found his way to communicate to the living world. So I put this spirit box on one day. We were setting up for a tour, and sometimes I'd have the devices on early before the guests got there. And I'd just sort of listen and see who's about, gather some information about the location. Because we do have records about this particular location. They're all obviously locked for about 75 years after the facility closed. So 2075 is when they'll probably be made available to the public. I'm in one of the rooms putting out some gear and just checking for any, trip hazards, doing the OH&S stuff that you do before you have guests in a location. So I turned on the spirit box and I heard someone go, hey. And I went, oh. And then again I listened and I went, hey. This really sort of deep, cool male voice that made me go, oh, someone's here. Oh, so excited. And anyway, I got into conversation with this young man and he said that his name was Adam. Now you're probably asking, how do I know that he was a convict? It was by the words that he used, which I'm going to explain later on. Now, he cottoned on to the fact that he could speak really well through this white noise, and he could be heard very clearly. And he was kind of chatty. It was interesting, because sometimes spirits will just give you their name, they'll say hello, and then they're gone again. I do wonder if Adam was a little bit lonely, whether he was sick of being around all his paranormal mates, around all his spirit friends, and he was just looking for someone to chat to in the living world, because he'd seen me there quite often. And often I find I'm a bit of a paranormal Pied Piper in the way that, because they know I'm a paranormal addict, I love the paranormal. I love communicating in a respectful way with spirits, dark energy beings, demonic level beings, elemental beings. I'm just curious about the whole thing. So he came forward and we had quite a few conversations. Now, like I said, he was very chatty. And sometimes he brought his mates with him. And his mates wouldn't speak to me, but they'd be there. Like, I could feel their presence. And I often say that I don't see spirits. I mean that I don't see them as fully developed apparition. I'm not sure of the correct terminology, but you know what I mean. They don't look like a solid person. I'll quite often see like a wavering energy presence in front of me, or the outline of a person when they move. When they move is always a sure sign. If you see with your frontal eyes or your peripheral vision, you see a movement, and you can't debunk it as the lighting or, I was in a paranormal hub. I was in a place where there was lots of spirits. So I just knew that they were there. And I just went about my business, setting up for the tour, and just chatted away with them. Now, I could hear them, on this particular day, Adam's there with his mates, and I could hear them having a conversation in the background. It was so funny. I felt like I was eavesdropping. I couldn't tell you the exact things that they were saying, but if you imagine, if you're just out with your mates, think of some of the things that you might say to each other. Adam had been there a long time, and he was very open to answering questions. I never shoot questions at spirits and just barrage them to get all the information I can out of them. I always want to build like a bit of a relationship, especially seeing I was going to be there at that site quite often. So it's nice for them to feel that they've got someone they can come and talk to. They're comfortable with me as a tour guide. They might open up a little bit more to using the equipment with some of the tour guests, if they've got someone there that they trust. Because remember, when you're working with the paranormal, it's all about respect. The same way you treat your mates, your friends, your family with respect, you treat spirits and your darker energy beings. Now, Adam didn't know how long he'd been at this site. He was just there. He didn't want to transition. I did ask him numerous times, and I assume he would have asked me to help if he'd wanted to go. He referred to the residents, as we would now call them at a mental health facility, he referred to them as inmates. And that got me thinking, that got me going, okay, so he has been there right from the early days when this particular site was originally a hospital for convicts. Adam talked about his life, that he was an inmate, there's that word again, and that he had a job to keep him busy while he was there. And also out of mischief, because I think he was a bit of a larrikin. I could tell by the way he talked and some of the things that he said, some of the terminology, he was a little bit of a cheeky bugger. So I figured that maybe he'd been sent here to Tasmania because of some of his naughty ways when he was back in England. So who knows what he got up to. While I was talking to Adam, we discussed his life there. He talked about his job, he talked about the food, he talked about his mates and what they got up to and how cold, oh my gosh, this place is really cold. I could just imagine in the days before electricity, how cold and uncomfortable that his job was, his sleeping quarters were. And in winter, it would have been freezing. Now, he said that his job was to wheel people in wheelie chairs, as he called them. He'd wheel people around this site. So it was a hospital in the early days. So he would be, if you wanted to equate it to a job today, it would be like what we call here in Hobart, we call them porters. So they work in hospitals. They help people travel around the hospital, going to different areas for medical procedures, going to the food area, back to their rooms. So he was very capable because in those days, in this particular site, if you had the mental capacity to work, and the physical, obviously, the physical capacity to work, you were given a job. You worked in the kitchen or cutting wood or in the laundry or in the gardens, and it would be good because you would have something to keep you busy other than sort of aimlessly wandering around. Now, we talked about his life as in the food. He said the food was okay. He said you could live on it. But he said the bread was hard. And most days they had vegetables. They didn't have meat very often. And he said that his mates and he would spend a lot of time outside. They didn't like it inside. If they could be outside, they'd either be working, and they would do any job that they were told to do, apart from he was assigned as a porter, but on his days off, he said, look, I don't want to sit around inside because he said the people that are here, they're either dangerous or they're so distressed. I actually think he was sent there more as a convict than as a mental health patient. He was there in those early days, like I said. Like, I'm trying to remember some of the history of this place. It started out as a hospital and then it verged into, because there were so many people, this is people and convicts that had mental health issues, that it eventually just became a mental health facility. And he said to me that he couldn't stand being with some of the mental health patients because it nearly drove him bonkers. So he would keep himself busy. He was very much into labouring. He liked his porter job, but he said it got a bit boring after a while. And then he liked to do things like small building repairs, cutting wood, repairing footpaths, weeding the gardens. Anything that he could do to keep busy is what he would do. But on the cold, wet days, he said they were, and in winter, that was the tricky time. But on the cold, wet days, they obviously couldn't be outside because of the weather. But they would stay in what I have been in as one of the large rooms. In this particular, I'm not allowed to mention the site, and I wouldn't do that. But there's a particular ward there that I have been upstairs, and we would get out decks of cards, like checkerboards, marbles, that sort of thing. And the spirits would respond to those particular games. We'd have these little light balls, they're actually a cat toy, but they're very well known as a paranormal investigation device because they're very, very sensitive to movement. So we would put out some games, like I just mentioned, and we'd set one of these cat balls sort of around the games. And we knew if the ball went off that someone was there attempting to sort of touch the games or maybe want to play with the cards or move one of the checkers. And these places had solid concrete floors, so there was no vibration. There was no movement of us moving around the room. Quite often I'd go and sit in those rooms and I'd have a deck of cards and some of the other things, and I would just sit on some of the very old furniture and I'd have the cat ball there. I'd have my spirit box and I would look and listen. And the light balls would quite often go off around the games. In one particular room that was upstairs on this 2-story building. It was quite fun. I do miss seeing those spirits. I do miss visiting them because I'm sure that they were a little bit lonely, a little bit sick of having to look at each other every single day for probably years upon years upon years if they lived that long. Now, you might think I'm a little bit crazy and I'm like, oh no, Anna's just made Adam up just to be able to tell a story. Well, we were in another building on this site because this was a large mental health facility and it had many, many, many different locations, different buildings that this lady used to run tours in. She heard his voice one night. We were in a room setting up and I had the spirit box on and I just said, Adam, are you around, mate? Do you want to come say hello? I haven't talked to you for ages. It'd be really nice to hear your voice. Oh, my goodness. And I'm setting up something in the room and all of a sudden I hear his characteristic, hey. It was so lovely. And this lady just looked at me and I'm like, yep, that's him. And it came through so strong. He had a really strong presence. Now, he was gentle. He was really gentle. And occasionally he would come and talk to me at my house. Now, this is interesting. One day I sat at my kitchen table. This is when I was really in paranormal addict mode. And I thought, right, I haven't talked to Adam for about a month. I'm just going to put the spirit box on. So I got it on, plugged in the speaker. And before I had a chance to ask if he was available for a chat, I heard a very bossy female voice that said, he's working. Now, I just sat there and I'm like, ooh, I wonder if this was a spirit staff member at the site, maybe a little bit annoyed at me for keeping Adam away from his work. Now, he didn't come to say hello that day. I suppose maybe he had been a little bit bored or he had work to do, or maybe his mates had given him a bit of a ribbing about talking to this living woman all the time who asked way too many questions. Where Adam chose to stay in spirit form, there were many, many spirits. There were children's spirits, adult residents, there were staff members, nurses, doctors, specialists. But I tell you what, you had to watch out for the matrons. They were as strict in death as they were in life. If I ever see him again, when I go to that site, if he gives me any information about why he was sent to Australia, I'll add a little post-edit in on this episode. If you like this spooky content of this episode today, please hit the subscribe button and you will get a notification when every new episode is released to the public. And stay tuned for many, many more episodes unpacking the strange and unseen aspects of the paranormal world around us. Back in episode 31, I shared an experience about a boy named Josh. God love Josh. He was just gorgeous. He resided at this same location. He didn't know anywhere else. Like he'd simply been put in this location for a particular reason, and he seemed quite happy there. Like he didn't know anything else, and he did like to go for rides in cars. Now, if you want to hear that funny story about Josh and his ride home with me, you can check out episode 31 of this podcast. But today we're going to look at Josh's antics while he was living in spirit at this very old mental health facility. I have to say, he's quite a character. And I've called this experience the Hugger. Now, Josh found me through a paranormal investigation experiment called the Estes method. Now, some of you might already know about this, but it was created by Carl Pfeiffer, who had the idea come to him while conducting a paranormal investigation at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, sometime in 2016. I'm going to talk about this experiment. I'm just going to set the scene for you though. Like I hadn't done this experiment before, and I was quite keen as a paranormal addict. You know, you could imagine it piqued my interest. I was always looking at trying different ways to connect with the spirit community, and especially at that particular location. So there I sat with a bunch of other people, this is living people, in a very dark room. Now my ears had been covered with noise-cancelling headphones, just like the 6 other people who were partaking in this experiment. And we all just kind of sat there just waiting, like none of us had done this before. We were just waiting to see what would happen. Now, each of our headphones were connected to a spirit box so that I could hear the white noise, which the spirits can use, like I mentioned earlier, to communicate through. Now, this noise was constant and it was a little bit loud, but I could manage it for the 10-minute session. Now, how this experiment worked, you can do this Estes experiment a couple of different ways, but we use this particular one today. Another person in the room, not wearing headphones, would call out questions to the spirits that were present at the site. Because believe me, they follow you around these buildings. They're either curious or they want company, or they're just simply existing in the particular room that we choose to do this experiment in. Now, we just wanted to see if anyone wearing the headphones could respond to the questions that this person asked. And you've got to remember, you can't hear the questions. So what you're doing is that you are simply yelling out whatever you hear through the spirit box, because the spirit or spirits can hear what's being said in the room by the living person. And they're going to communicate through one of us 6 or 7 people. They're going to communicate through us the answer. And as I'm sitting there saying everything that I heard, I saw a boy. Now, this boy appeared in my third eye, in my mind. Depends how you want to look at it. But I saw him in my head. He was a teenage boy, and he was kind of far off. He was in the distance at that moment. I suppose he was just gauging, was I going to be friendly? He didn't know me. Was he a bit nervous? And I just sat there quietly, just looking at him, because he knew that I could see him in my mind. And once he felt comfortable, he started to come closer. Now, sometimes when you see spirits, I'm one of those people that doesn't see the full apparition, as I mentioned earlier, but I'll see parts of the person. If I'm meant to know something about their feet, I might just see their legs. Or if they're making arm gestures about a particular answer or they want me to know something, I might just see these random hands just doing something. But this boy, I have to tell you, I saw his face as clear as day. He was smiling. Josh has the biggest smile that I've ever seen. It goes from ear to ear. And he just stood there smiling at me. Now, I'm supposed to be partaking in this experiment, but you've got all these other people answering the questions. So I thought, right, I'm going to focus on Josh. He obviously wants to say something. And he'd found, like Adam, he'd found someone that could see him, that could maybe relate to him, maybe understand him. Like I worked at schools for a long time in a teacher aide position, so I'm very comfortable around kids and young people. So I started asking Josh some questions in my mind, and he would show me visuals, or I would get feelings as the answers, because feeling is my first psychic sense. I suppose that seeing is my second, hearing is my third. Sometimes they're all sort of chucked in the same bucket and it's a bit hard to tell. But it doesn't really matter. If you're getting communications, that's the important thing. I asked Josh questions like, what is your name? And Josh is what he said. He said, Josh, really loud, and like he jumped as he said it. It was so jovial. For someone who was at a mental health facility, he was extremely happy and bright and cheerful, not what you would expect as a resident at a mental health facility. And I responded with, it's so nice to meet you, Josh. And I said, do you know how old you are? And what I saw was his shoulders shrugging. I didn't see his face, but like he was showing me his shoulders moving up and down. And I knew that meant, I don't know. Now, like I mentioned earlier in Adam's story, this facility had been home for many different types of people. Those with diagnosed mental health issues, but also those whose families didn't understand their behaviours. Now, it could even be husbands who had devious intentions to do away with their wives, and they would tell doctors these stories about how deranged their wives were and that they needed mental health care, and they would actually get put into these facilities and never let out again. Now, some people, even children like Josh was different. You know, if you saw Josh's face, you would understand what I meant. In the early 1800s, society wasn't very kind. And people were put into these facilities because their families didn't know how to look after them, or they couldn't cope, or they were even embarrassed by them. Now, Josh had what I could describe to you, seeing his face as what I would relate to a young person now or to a child now, was someone who had Down syndrome. In those early days back in the 1800s, they wouldn't have understood Down syndrome. Now, we know things differently now, but you've got to imagine back in the 1800s, it was a very different place to be. So sometimes people with differences were sent to these facilities for care. Now, since Josh had shown his face to me, oh, it's so funny, I do love him dearly, he would quite often show up on tours. We would have people there touring the facility with paranormal investigation devices, wishing to connect with the spirits. And oh my gosh, he is so friendly. And he would often hug some of our tour guests. Like he would give them what I call great big bear hugs. Now these great big bear hugs would quite often freak out the living people. Like Josh had a habit, I think he was a bit cheeky as well, because he knew how to get responses out of people, but in a nice way. He was just looking for some attention. He was really very sweet. Now he would sneak up behind people, usually the ladies, and he would give them these great big cuddles around the middle of their bodies. And people would feel his presence and they kind of wouldn't know what it was. And how they explained it to me is they felt like they were being sort of cuddled or slightly squeezed from behind. And Josh really, he didn't understand personal boundaries. Like he would get in your face. Quite often he would get right up close to my face. And I'd say, I know there's a spirit here. Is that you, Josh? Come on, mate. You know now, people need boundaries. You need to just step back a little bit. And the spirit would then move back. His personal boundary understanding was about 30 centimetres. So I figured that was better than being like, 5 centimetres from my face. Like he'd get up really, really close because he would be looking at you. He'd be looking at your personal expressions. He'd be finding ways to get your attention. He did love people. Now, this is a little funny side note. Josh has a girlfriend. And you're thinking, how on earth does she know that? Well, we were on tour one night, and I wasn't particularly thinking about Josh. I was talking about the building, giving some history of the building that we were in. He came to me that night, right in the middle of me talking, and I saw him holding hands with a young lady. And the girl was about his age. I could see her as clear as day. Now, I was happy to see that Josh had a friend to spend time with. It was really, really lovely. And they just stood there holding hands and just swinging their arms. They were so innocent, and it made me feel, I had a bit of a tear in my eye. I thought, oh, Josh has got a girlfriend. Oh, it was so lovely. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Lovely memory for me to have forever. Now, one night on tour, I was with some guests. And we were upstairs in the nurses' quarters. And I suddenly felt something or someone touching my forehead. And this finger was making little circles in the area of my third eye. Now, if you're not sure where that is, imagine your forehead and between your eyebrows and then go up about an inch. That's about the spot. And there was this sensation and slight pressure of a finger going round and round and round in slow motion circles. And I just stood there because the tour guests, they'd gone off with their devices. So I was kind of there supervising and answering questions. Now, these circles lasted for about 30 seconds. As the circles stopped, I got a quick flash in my mind of Josh and his girlfriend. They just popped in to say hello. Maybe they were out for the night. We were on a Saturday night tour. Maybe the spirits, were going into town. They can go wherever they want in spirit form. But they just come to see me to say hello. I do wonder, how did they find me amongst all those other people that were there? Do they see my energy? Do I vibrate a particular way? Do the colours in my auric field, is there a particular colour that I shine? Or does my energy field sort of shine a different way? Or simply, did Josh hear my very loud voice? Because my voice does carry, as people tell me. I don't get to go to that location very often now, but I still, from time to time, think about Josh and his huge smile. And I hope that he's still dishing out those great big bear hugs. Now we're going to look at another type of energy being present at that particular site. Was this an entity of the darker kind? You're going to have to listen and make up your own mind. And I've called this experience the growler. Now, at that location, there were many, many buildings. And we would do tours in most of them. And sometimes there was a very strong presence who used to move about in those buildings and hide in some of the dark rooms. Staff on the tours and sometimes the guests would hear very distinct animal or specifically dog-like growling. We would get guests who would come running out of rooms with fear on their faces and kind of just need a bit of reassurance that they were safe and they were okay. But they're like, I heard growling. Like, it's not the wind. It's not the creaky floorboards. They've done all the debunking. It was a growl. And they would be pointing to the room going, I'm not going in there again. And one night, I can specifically say that we were setting up for a tour in 2 buildings. And part of setting up for the tours meant that you needed to walk around the buildings. You needed to do a check for OH&S to make sure the rooms were safe for people to be in. And sometimes you'd go into particular rooms and you'd hear a noise. And I never expected, there was never any expectation that I would hear a growl. Because sometimes if you set that up in your mind, even the slightest wind howling or the slightest creaking of a floorboard or a door, you're going, ooh, there's growling. But this particular growl was very specific to an animal type growling. You can imagine hearing maybe a German shepherd who's a little bit upset, got his ears back and he's baring his teeth and he's growling. Just imagine that in your mind. That's the type of growling we would hear in some of these rooms. Now, this particular location had no electricity. It was dark, it was cold, and sometimes you get specific types of elemental beings or some of the darker beings that are on this location for different reasons, and they would just hide in some of the really, really dark recesses of these buildings. And sometimes you would feel the hairs standing up on your arms and the back of your neck. And you would get the sort of the sudden body shivers when in the presence of this growling entity in these dark spaces. From my experience, generally spirits don't growl. I've never heard a spirit growl yet. I mean, they can be angry, they can yell, they can scream, they can sometimes throw things at you, but I've never heard them growl in this particular way. And the same with what I would call dark energy beings. But that being said, these beings will use particular tactics because they know they'll get the response they want. It's either to frighten you or to say, don't come in here, this is my territory. Because sometimes the energy beings can be very territorial. And it can be, if they're dark beings or demonic level beings, it can be because they're feeding off of a particular pool of energy, a pool of emotions in those locations where you hear the growling. So you tend to just go, you know what, I'm just going to stay away from that space. Now, this particular growling being could be the entity who lived behind the stairs. I shared that experience back in episode 4. That was extremely memorable. He was a fascinating and rather interesting character who took quite a liking to me. And he used to wander about this site. And it's so funny. He used to also drop these really bad smells. I've smelt it and I'm like, yep, I know he's about. And some people didn't smell it and other tour guests did. And other times we think that he may have been the one that actually scratched one very disrespectful tour guest. And sometimes beings will do that to pull people into line, to give them a bit of a fright and go, hey, that's not respectful. Don't be disrespectful to my building. They're very, very territorial. And he was one tough cookie. If you want to hear the full episode about what he got up to and how he came and visited me sometimes for particular reasons, go right back to the beginning of this podcast and check out episode 4. Now, the growler could also have been another type of elemental being that was seeking solitude, maybe trying to find a place to hide or to sleep, or to bunk down while travelling elsewhere in this reality? Or was it multiple energy beings? And they were all growlers. That was just their one particular tactic. And they used to like to do it because they knew it would give them a giggle while they frightened us living people. I guess I'll never know, but I will never actually forget the sound of the growling that I heard one night in this particular building. And what I did when this being growled, like it was right in my ear. I didn't jump. I didn't run, I didn't scream. My response is to stop and observe. I said very quietly out loud, do apologise for interrupting you. I'm going to leave this room now. Thank you for letting me know that you don't want me in here. I just backed out of that room. We needed to use that building that night, but I did my best to guide people away from that particular room because there was something in there that didn't want people in there. So who it was, guess I'll never know. But these experiences are some of the most memorable that I will never forget. So in episode 68, we are talking with Eric Lingen from the Spirit World Centre. Eric educates people from all around the world about the spirit ecosystem that we live amongst. He's going to share his thoughts and experiences with the upward spiral of fear in home hauntings and how to manage those emotions and your responses when you have spirit interactions in your home. He also expresses his thoughts on the rights of spirits, This is the kind of person I like. I believe in the rights of the living and the non-living. And he's going to talk about why these beings are here and so much more. So join us for a mind-opening experience of Spirit Talk. And I'll see you next week. So thank you for joining me today. And don't forget, if you want to share a paranormal experience just with myself, or you would like me to share one of your experiences through my podcast, you can do a voice recording, or you can write out your experience and I will read it exactly as you have written. You can email me at spiritualbeing44@gmail.com. And for information on paranormal house clearing, you can visit my website, Spiritual Being. You will find the address in the description box. And I look forward to sharing this spooky space again with you next week. And remember, life is perfectly paranormal.